On the 9th of October 1963, a wall of water 250 meters high went over the top of the Vajont Dam in northern Italy and erased 5 villages in about 4 minutes. Somewhere near 2,000 people died. And when the engineers came up the valley the next morning, expecting to find rubble, the dam was still there, intact, barely scratched. It is still standing today, 60 years later, holding back nothing at all. The Vajont Dam did not fail. That is the worst thing about it. The dam sits in a narrow gorge above the Piave Valley in the Veneto, about 100 kilometers north of Venice. It was built between 1957 and 1959 by a private power company called SAID, and it was, at the moment of its completion, the tallest dam in the world, 262 meters of concrete, a double curvature arch design, which is the most elegant and most efficient shape in the whole of dam engineering. Instead of holding water back by sheer mass, an arch dam transmits the load sideways into the rock walls of the canyon. It uses the mountain itself as part of the structure. Done well, it lets you build something enormously tall out of a surprisingly thin shell of concrete. Vajont was done well. The arch was the work of Carlo Semenza, one of the best dam engineers in Europe, and by every measure of the discipline it was a triumph. Slender, precise, and far stronger than it needed to be. The engineering was not the problem. The problem was the left-hand wall. The dam was anchored into the flank of a mountain called Monte Toc. The name comes from the local dialect, from patok, meaning rotten or broken. The people who farmed that valley had been calling it the mountain that walks for as long as anyone could remember, because the ground on that slope moved. Not dramatically, not all at once. It crept. Fences came out of alignment. Field boundaries shifted. It was the sort of local knowledge that does not appear in a survey. It should have appeared in this one. In 1959, a young geologist named Edoardo Semenza, the son of the dam's own designer, surveyed the slope above the reservoir and concluded that he was standing on something enormous, the body of an ancient landslide, a slab of the mountain that had already broken loose in the distant past and was sitting there, poised. He estimated its volume in the hundreds of millions of cubic meters. He was telling the company that built the world's tallest dam that the wall beside it was not a wall. It was a lid. Then they began to fill the reservoir, and the mountain answered. In November 1960, with the water partway up, roughly 800,000 cubic meters of rock slid into the lake. That is a substantial landslide by any normal standard, and it was a fraction of what was waiting. A crack opened along the flank of Monte Toc in the shape of a long M, and it ran for about 2 kilometers. Surveyors put markers on the slope and measured it moving, some weeks by a few millimeters, some weeks by several centimeters. Everyone involved now knew the mountain was live. What they did next is the part that turns an accident into something else. SAID did not stop. Instead, the company adopted a theory that the slide could be managed by controlling the water level. Raise the reservoir and the slope would creep faster. Lower it and the creep would slow. If the movement could be throttled with the valve, then the mountain could be walked down gently into the lake in a slow, survivable slide. If the scale of this is getting to you, hit subscribe. We take apart a new Colossus every week. It was not an absurd idea on paper, and the measurements even seemed to support it for a while. But it rested on an assumption nobody had earned, that the thing on the slope would come down in pieces, over months, and not all at once. Meanwhile, the valley below was told very little. A journalist named Tina Merlin wrote about the danger in a communist newspaper and was prosecuted for spreading news likely to disturb public order. She was acquitted. The reporting continued and it changed nothing. In 1962, the whole system was folded into the newly nationalized power company, Enel, and the filling went on. By late September 1963, the slope was moving several centimeters a day. Animals were taken off the mountain. The engineers began drawing the reservoir down, trying once more to slow the creep with the valve. It did not slow. On the 9th of October, it accelerated past anything they had recorded, and at about 22:39 that night, the entire mass let go at once. Roughly 270 million cubic meters of rock, a piece of mountain something like 2 kilometers across, entered the reservoir at somewhere near 100 kilometers an hour. It did not slide in. It arrived. The lake had nowhere to go, and the physics of that are brutally simple. Put a solid object into a full container, and the contents leave. About 50 million cubic meters of water were thrown out of the gorge. Part of it went up the far side of the valley and stripped the village of Casso. The rest went over the crest of the dam in a wave standing roughly 250 meters above it and fell down the other side into the Piave. Longarone was directly below. So were Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, Faye. The wave that reached them was not really water anymore. It was water carrying rock and air, moving fast enough that survivors described a pressure wave arriving before the flood itself, blowing out windows and pulling roofs off. Longarone was not damaged. It was removed, down to the foundations, and the ground where it had been was left scoured flat. The death toll is usually given as around 1,910. Whole families ended in a single night, and a substantial number of the dead were never identified. And the dam held. The arch that Carlo Semenza designed absorbed a load nobody had ever contemplated putting on a dam, a 250-meter column of water going over the top of it, and lost the top meter or so of its crest. That is all. The structure stands there today, and you can walk across it, and the gorge behind it is filled almost to the top with the mountain. The trial that followed moved to L'Aquila, far from the valley, on the grounds that a local jury could not be impartial. A handful of officials were convicted. The sentences were short, several were reduced on appeal, and one of the engineers, Mario Pancini, killed himself before the process was finished. The compensation took decades. In 2008, UNESCO put Vajont on a list of cautionary case studies, 5 disasters chosen as examples of the failure of engineers and managers, rather than of engineering. That is the distinction the story exists to make. Every instinct we have about a catastrophe like this says, look for the flaw, the bad weld, the cut corner, the concrete that was not what the invoice claimed. There is no flaw here. The dam was excellent. The dam is still excellent. What failed at Vajont was the decision to keep filling a reservoir after the mountain beside it had already told them, in writing, in survey markers, in a 2-kilometer crack, exactly what it intended to do. The structure was never the dangerous part. The confidence in the structure was. There is a version of this story in every valley where something enormous was built against a slope that somebody, at some point, said was fine. Some of those are still holding.